the wildlife. Talk a little bit about why I think, at least, and some of the collaborators on this project think that it's particularly strong in terms of some of the bridges we've been able to gap, some of the work that we've actually accomplished to date, and then cover some of what's really coming out of this work. What are the expectations in terms of long-term data sets and that sort of thing. And then finally, we'll wrap up with talking about some of the challenges we faced, maybe some opportunities for learning for folks that are thinking about pursuing something similar down the road, and some ideas, some thoughts about future directions, and many of which are sort of echoing things that are already out there. So I think most folks are familiar with the spotted owl story. So I'll just cover it briefly, and certainly there's plenty of information out there about spotted owls. Essentially, they're very controversial species, and most of that controversy originated in 1990 when the northern spotted owl was listed. There's a cover of Time magazine there suggesting that it was going to cost 30,000 jobs in the timber industry. And the Mexican spotted owl, which is the smallest of the 3 subspecies of spotted owls with the largest geographic range, interestingly, was listed in 1993 as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, primarily because of concerns surrounding loss of nesting habitat due to even-aged forest management practices. So I think, again, a lot of folks are familiar with the public sentiment. Really, the public perception is that this species is responsible for a dramatic decline in forest products industries. And, in many ways that's true. So I don't think that's necessarily a point of debate. What I would say is, it's probably a little less contentious in the Southwest than it has been in other places, but certainly there's plenty of issues with the public and with elected officials and that sort of thing. I do enjoy some of the hats. There was for a long time there was a cafe near the Lincoln National Forest, or on the Lincoln, in a town called Mayhill, that had spotted owl on the menu. Obviously it wasn't really spotted owl, but you get the point. So addressing some of the sentiments of elected officials, Steve Pierce is a U.S. congressman who's from my district in New Mexico. And this is a quote that I borrowed from the High Country News that was published in June 2011, sort of coinciding with the time when the first revision of the recovery plan was being drafted and that sort of thing. And certainly Congressman Pierce is one of those folks that attributes the timber industry decline to the listing of the species. So he had suggested that he actually introduced a bill that would have provided sanctuaries for spotted owls and would have restarted jobs in the timber industry. So that's kind of an interesting segue as to how all this got started. Many folks probably remember that in 2012, June of 2012, the Little Bear Fire was started, actually June 4th, I believe, near where I live on the Lincoln National Forest. It was a lightning ignition in the White Mountain Wilderness. It's over the next several days, it ended up burning out of control, entered the very sort of complex WUI that we have here in Ruidoso, and ended up consuming somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 structures. During that time, Congressman Pierce was here. He had some fairly contentious back and forth with some of the Forest Service officials, and out of that came an invitation for the congressman to visit Ruidoso after the fire. So that fall, or late summer, I don't remember exactly when it was, a friend and colleague, someone who I believe might be on this call today, invited me to attend a tour of the burn scar with the congressman, and I did so. And one of the things that came up after we met with some folks on Mescalero is this idea of the listing of the species, the spotted owl, preventing a lot of timber or forest treatments that would have potentially mitigated the effects of the Little Bear Fire. And that really sort of, Mescalero folks had been conducting forest management activities in spotted owl habitat for years, and so this idea was created whereby we would start a project that would allow us to bridge the gap between these sort of disparate worlds, the Forest Service side of things and the Mescalero side of things. And there's also some context there that I'll get to in a sec regarding the Rocky Mountain Research Station. So again, for the wildlife folks, or folks from that might not be super fire familiar, A brief introduction, the Wildland-Urban Interface, or so-called WUI. This is where, timber or forest areas that are at risk of wildfire meet urban areas. It's obviously a threat. I'm not going to get too far into it. This is a picture of downtown Cloudcroft, New Mexico, near where we conducted some of our forest treatments. You can see that the WUI is, sort of directly adjacent to town. So many places in the Southwest, including a lot of areas where I live in the South Central Mountains, Mexican spotted owl habitat overlaps with the WUI. So Cloudcroft's a perfect example of that. There are a number of these PACs, protected activity centers, which we'll get to in a sec, that are directly adjacent to the community of Cloudcroft. And therefore, potentially, if there are restrictions on what can be done in those protected activity centers, then it's going to impact how that WUI is dealt with from a community protection perspective. So the idea then is that if, and this is what kind of came from this meeting with the congressman and some thinking and discussions afterwards, and this is not by any means an original thought of mine. This is something that a lot of folks had thought of for a long time, including a lot of folks at the Rocky Mountain Research Station, which I'll address in a sec. But the idea is that if a program could evaluate how these fuel reduction treatments actually impacted a suite of ecological complexes, including in particular Mexican spotted owls, it would help develop a framework for effective management strategies in terms of reducing fuels, particularly those that are in the WUI and also considered to be spotted owl habitat. So background on owls. Again, I know some wildlife folks, and certainly there are owl folks on the line who know a lot more about this than I do, but I'll just give a brief background on the story with owls and cover some of the terms that I'm going to be using throughout the talk. Basically, I mentioned this before, the Mexican spotted owl was listed in 1993 as threatened, and the recovery plan, which was generated in 1995, provides guidelines for the creation of what are called protected activity centers. The idea there being that limitations on owls were created by shortages or limits of nesting and roosting habitat, and that if you could protect essentially 600 acres surrounding sites that were known nesting or roosting sites, then that would provide maybe not adequate, but at least habitat for those owls. In addition to that, within that 600-acre block of a habitat that we call a protected activity center, and I'll use the term PAC a lot. You'll hear a lot of owl people using PAC, so you'll probably hear me use it again today. But in addition to PACs, we have these no-touch zones or nest core areas, and that was something that was in the 1995 recovery plan. And so although there may be some habitat treatment or management guidelines within the PACs, there are potentially more restrictive guidelines within these no-touch areas. And so the idea is that these are the areas where the owl is nesting, and that there essentially no management activities will take place there. And I will say that in the work that we've done here in the Sacramento Mountains, we did utilize these nest core areas, no-touch areas, and adhered to those restrictions that were in the 1995 plan. In terms of the area where we've done our work and where this stuff is taking place, two sites. There's national forest lands as well as Mescalero Apache tribal lands, which I'll get to in a sec. But the Sacramento district of the Lincoln National Forest is shown here on the left. You can see a map, and I'll see maybe if I can get this pointer to work. So it's basically one of the most dense aggregations of Mexican spotted owl protected activity centers in the Southwest. I actually spoke with the district biologist there last night just to get the most recent update on the number of PACs. There are 121 protected activity centers there. If you calculate, do some simple math, 600 acres, a minimum of 600 acres per PAC, that means there's a minimum of 72,500 acres included in these areas that are potentially restricted from management activities, or at least guided in their management activities by the spotted owl recovery plan. The other place where we did some work, it was on tribal lands, Mescalero Apache tribal lands. The Mescalero Reservation, it's home to the federally recognized Mescalero Apache tribe. It occupies about 460,000 acres. That's sandwiched between the Smoky Bear district of the Lincoln National Forest, which is north of tribal lands, and the Sacramento district. which is south of tribal lands. And the data on MSO, packs, and occupancy are not public, but habitat is sort of broadly similar to adjacent national forest, as you might expect. So I'm going to toggle back to this one real quick. So if you can see this little area here, that would be where Mescalero tribal lands, the reservation, sort of abuts the Lincoln National Forest. And in this map that has all the protected activity centers on the Sacramento district, it would be right in there. So you can imagine that if you carried on that distribution of protected activity centers from Lincoln National Forest lands onto tribal lands, you can get a pretty good idea that the habitat's contiguous and sort of broadly similar. And there's certainly a number of owls on tribal lands as well. So background on previous work, and this is really important, and I want to make sure that I give lots of credit for this, because none of this, the work that I've done, is really something that I thought of. There were folks working on this a long time before I came on the scene. And so beginning in 2002, the Rocky Mountain Research Station, which for those of you that don't know, it's one of the research branches of the Forest Service, they launched a pilot project intended to assess impacts of a variety of different forest treatment or management strategies on Mexican spotted owls and associated ecological linkages or relationships. The project went through a number of sort of course corrections and rethinking of ideas and strategies before, unfortunately, they went through a funding cut, and the project sort of came to an end in 2011. But they did a lot of work, a lot of really important work on owl demography and habitat use and that sort of thing in the Sacramento Mountains. And certainly the project that we've put together, the collaborative group here, builds on that work. So one of the things that came out of this, and this is attributable to Pat Ward, he was around and came up with all of these ideas, and so credit goes to him for coming up with this stuff, was this idea of a coordinated management, monitoring, and research program. And it called for evaluation, again, of a variety of forest treatments and then those ecological trends. The big ones are changes in the vegetation components of treated areas. Obviously, that's important, and that's something that we'll get to in a minute in terms of how the Collaborative Forest Restoration Program fits into that. Changes in owl prey base, which is also important. We'll talk about why that's important, because owls are long-lived and that sort of thing. And then, of course, ongoing monitoring of owl occupancy and demography. And so those are the three important components of what would need to be looked at if you were going to conduct management activities in owl habitat. And those are, again, things that are also in the recovery plan. I'm not claiming credit for having thought of those myself. So there were, again, several different forest treatments that were identified by the Rocky Mountain Research Station as being potentially useful or useful in terms of evaluating them in spotted owl habitat. During the time when RMRS was working here in the Sacramentos, they included things like pre-commercial thinning. But one of the other ones that Pat came up with was the idea of these patch cuts or open canopy treatments. And they were essentially little openings in the forest canopy, about a ½ acre to 1 acre in size. And this is, what you're looking at now is actually the layout of some of the patch cuts that we performed on a pack here in the Sacramento district. And you can see that they're very, sort of asymmetrical and just kind of, thrown on the landscape like you might see in a natural disturbance. So what are the benefits that those open canopy treatments might provide? Well, they serve several purposes. So first and foremost, when we're talking about management activities designed to impact fuels aggregations and potentially impact fire severity, those open canopy treatments disrupt fuel continuity. So if you have a wildfire burning and that you hit a patch where there's no fuels, that's an obvious disruption to the continuity of those fuels, potentially impactful from a fire perspective. They're also intended to mimic natural disturbance, and that's with the caveat, of course, that it's very difficult to mimic natural disturbance with mechanical treatments. There's been a number of studies, the Fire and Fire Surrogates program or study that occurred over a number of years in the early 2000s, looked at a lot of this stuff. But the idea is, and you can see this picture here from the NASA Earth Observatory, that there's a little a little patch there, the high severity burn, and this overall mosaic of burn severity. And the idea is that these open canopy treatments would sort of broadly mimic that. Another important component is that they could potentially improve habitat for the owl prey base. Owls here in the Sacramento district, Mexican spotted owls in the Sacramento Mountains rather, utilize wood rats primarily as their main prey base, and the idea would be that if you had these openings, you could get some of the herbaceous plants that might come back in to fill some of these openings during early successional stages, and then provide habitat for those wood rats and improve that prey base. And then additionally, they could provide foraging opportunities for owls. And we know from a lot of data that, including some stuff that's been published from work here in the Sacramento Mountains, that owls do forage in areas. They'll forage in burned areas, preferentially at times, in part because, or the thought is at least, that they're more open, and that there's also greater prey abundance in some of those areas as well. So that brings us to the idea of funding the implementation of some of the treatments that were sort of thought of and outlined by the Rocky Mountain Research Station during their work. And again, building on this whole notion of a conversation with the congressman and some folks at Mescalero for the need to bridge the gap between the places where work was being done and places where it wasn't necessarily being done, and putting some data behind some of these efforts. So I know a number of folks probably aren't familiar with the Collaborative Forest Restoration Program. If you're in Arizona, you might be more familiar with the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, which is funding some large-scale restoration efforts there. They're broadly similar, except for the CFRP program, which I'm saying program twice when I say that, but CFRP is a New Mexico-specific program. It was legislatively established. Senator Jeff Bingaman, a former senator in New Mexico, was the one who spearheaded this legislation. And it was established to fund forest restoration projects in New Mexico. So, I stole this slide from a talk that Walter Dunn, who runs the program, gave at the CFRP workshop last year. Over that period of time, from 2001 through the end of last year, approximately 50,000 acres will have been treated through funding provided by the CFRP grant program. So, more specifics on it, and what's interesting about this stuff is a lot of it actually fits quite well with some of the guidelines that were outlined in the most recent edition of the Spotted Owl Recovery Plan. So the CFRP program actually has 3 categories of grants that are available to applicants. The first category, there's a planning category. There's also a utilization category, and the planning is for doing NEPA work on places that might be slated for restoration activities. The utilization category would be to provide infrastructure for folks that are engaged in timber products or wood products industries to expand their capacity. And then there's the largest category of these implementation grants, and that's the grant that we received to do some of this work. They include several important caveats. So first and foremost, they must be intended to or provide for the reduction of wildfire threats, specifically high severity wildfire. I think the wording of the legislation actually says high intensity, but that's for another discussion at another time. With the idea of restoring ecosystem function and appropriate fire regimes, and then also serving to potentially reduce non-native species. There's been a lot of projects, for example, funded in the Bosque, and those are, of course, areas that have a lot of non-native species like salt cedar. And then there's this important caveat of preserving old and large trees. So that's an important thing, and also something that's mentioned in the new recovery plan is necessary for activities that take place in management activities that take place in spotted owl habitat. And then in addition to that, you have to include a diverse group of stakeholders. There's, for example, one of the caveats of the CFRP grant program includes bringing an NGO or a conservation group on board to be part of the collaborative team. There has to be an educational or outreach component. So it's a very collaborative approach to these things. And then there's an industry or an economic perspective as well. There has to be some utilization of small diameter trees because that's been identified as being a place where we're lacking in terms of the timber industry these days, and create forest-related employment. And so as we were moving forward with trying to fund implementation of some of the treatments that RMRS had come up with over their years, we also had to adhere to all of these tenets that are put forth by the Collaborative Forest Restoration Program. Now, I do want to point out that leveraging funding is important. So the CFRP legislation specifically does not fund research initiatives. So they're very clear. This is not a research grant. This isn't an NSF thing. So it's really intended to instead be a driver of restoration practices and/or improvement in forest products industries. But that doesn't mean that that funding can't be leveraged to provide information that's necessary. So again, having that funding available and couching it in terms that were sort of agreeable and making sure you hit all of those important points, we were able to leverage that funding to not only provide for the implementation, but then also provide for monitoring of the ecological impacts of these forest treatments. So that brings us to the specifics of the CFRP program that we've developed here, and I say we. I was just happened to be the lead author on it. It's a big collaborative group, and I'll get to everyone that was involved towards the end of the talk. But the overall goals are to, of course, increase and/or restore resiliency of forested lands that were occupied by Mexican spotted owls in the Sacramento Mountains. Now, that's obviously a broad goal, but and we had a much smaller footprint, of course, than the 72,000 acres that are occupied on the Sacramento district. But the overall idea was to, at least increase some of that resiliency in the areas where we implemented our treatments. Of course, it was also important to determine impacts of a couple different types of forest treatments, and I'll talk about the specifics of those treatments here in a minute, as well as their prey base through post-treatment monitoring. And then, after that implementation has occurred, future fire severity would be lessened because the fuel continuity would be disrupted, and there would be some sort of mimicking of natural disturbance. And ideally, particularly through the use of prescribed fire, a reestablishment or an attempt at reestablishment of appropriate fire regimes. And that's a very difficult thing, and I'll talk about some of the challenges we faced on this project here in a minute. It's also important, and these are, again, tenets of the CFRP program, that we provided economic opportunities for small timber operators as well as utilizers. So it's not enough just to cut the wood. It also needs to be used for something. And then provide employment for tribal members. And that's, for me at least, one of the things that I was the most happy about. We had a prescribed fire last week, and it was really great to see the tribal crew out there, doing some work that was provided, the funding for which was provided by the CFRP program. And then perhaps most importantly, and I'll talk about this more when we get to the strengths of this particular program, it was important to engage a disparate collaborative group. And one of the things that we did was successfully, at least to this point, and we're in year 3 of this grant program, was to get a number of people who haven't necessarily worked together in the past, working towards a common goal, and that is, providing a model for future forest restoration activities in MSO-occupied habitat in the Southwest, or at least attempting to do that. And I know there's a lot of folks that are working on that, but that's sort of the broad idea. So let's switch over here. So what have we actually done then? The actions themselves, first and foremost, as I sort of described before with those open canopy treatments, there was, implementation of open canopy treatments, mechanical, essentially commercial. The logs were sold to a utilizer, which I'll get to in a sec, in 5 packs, protected activity centers on the Sacramento district of the Lincoln. We completed that work in fall of 2013. Now, I won't get too far into the details. There's some issues about how much money you get from the grant each year. We ended up with about $360,000, and you only get a third of that per year. We sort of overspent in the first year, which sort of limited what we were able to do the second year. But that was okay. We had worked with some Forest Service folks to make that happen, and it allowed us to actually get all of that implementation done on the Lincoln as soon as we were awarded the funds in that first year. There was also an important implementation of broadcast prescribed fire on 2 packs on Mescalero lands. We did a pretty good job of getting one of those burned last fall. The second one really didn't get much. Burn windows are hard to find. I'll talk about that as one of our challenges in a minute. And then we were able to burn the other pack in a much more effective way, at least in my opinion. We haven't really gone back in and looked at it yet. We'll be doing that soon, although I was out on the fire and was there watching it, so I can say anecdotally at least that it was much more effective just last week. We also completed a pre-commercial thinning project on a pack on Mescalero lands. The specifics of that prescription are mentioned there, shelter wood and a single tree selection. That was also just completed last month, and again, employing tribal members. In fact, the same guys who were on the fire crew doing our RX work were the ones that were doing the thinning on that pack the previous month. And then, of course, measurement of pre- and post-treatment veg conditions. We actually utilized a common stand exam methodology. That's an important component of the CFRP program, is making sure that what you've said you're going to do is actually done in terms of implementing some sort of forest treatments. We chose to use CSE methodology, and I'll give credit to the person that did that. Mostly it was Kim Kuhar. I'm not sure if she's on the line today, but certainly thanks go to her. And that's an interesting thing too, because we had a Forest Service employee helping out with some veg stuff over on Mescalero land, so that was really great from a number of advantages. And then, of course, continuation of MSO occupancy reproduction monitoring in all the treated packs, and that's standard Fish and Wildlife Service protocol on Lincoln lands that was performed by the Wildlife Shop on the Sacramento District. Jack Williams and his crew, Ryan Jonas, did a lot of that early on. And then on Mescalero, we had some contractors that have been doing it for a number of years that continued with it, as well as a program collaborator, Sarah Hoagland, has helped out with that a lot. And we're hoping to keep those surveys going at least through the summer of 2017. And I'll talk a little bit more at the end of the presentation about other avenues for funding and how we hope to potentially expand our sample size and then maybe provide funding for longer-term monitoring of these implementations. And then perhaps most importantly, at least in terms of adhering to what the Rocky Mountain Research Station had done prior to having their funding cut, was this implementation of pre-treatment small mammal surveys. And we've also continued those post-treatment both on Lincoln lands as well as, last year we did some burning on Mescalero lands, and so we trapped in those areas this past summer. And there's a standard protocol. There's a big trapping grid. I have some maps you'll see in a sec that lay those out. Essentially a 6x4 grid, so 24 traps, 80-meter spacing. You're tagging the individual small mammals and then collecting standard morphometric data. And we're also hoping to continue that at least through the summer of 17. And that's all with the funding that we have now. And it's been, a challenge. Obviously, a lot of this trapping occurs, during monsoon, so there's always challenges with weather and field crews and undergraduate students that might quit on you at the last minute and that sort of thing. So here's an outline or a map of the treatments on the Lincoln National Forest. You can see on the right there's a map there of the 3 districts of the Lincoln. I'll put the arrow there again. That would be where Mescalero lands are. Sort of broadly, you can see the Smoky Bear District to the north and the Sacramento Ranger District to the south. Those are our 5 packs. I know that it's hard to see that map on your left, but those little squares that are right there, those would be our trapping grid. So within each pack, and I'll give you an acreage estimate or a number of acres treated, the packs were sort of divided into areas that would be treated using this open canopy treatments and then control areas within the same pack. And we then had small mammal grids both within the treatment areas and within the untreated areas. And the same model was used on Mescalero lands. And I have some maps and diagrams of those, which we'll get to in a sec. So there's a shot of one of the open canopy treatments about a year out. You can actually see that there's quite a bit of slash and stuff left on the ground. One of my buddies here, who's a longtime forester on Mescalero, Bill Hornsby, reminded me that logging is not necessarily a pretty thing, at least right away, and so that's something to always bear in mind when wildlife folks tend to want stuff to look really good right away. At least that's my perspective on stuff. But it's important to realize that you're getting a bunch of big machines in there, doing a bunch of work, moving a lot of wood, and the forests take time to sort of move into their different serial stages following some sort of disturbance. And the mechanical treatment is a disturbance just like anything else. But this gives you an idea of what these open canopy treatments are. They're essentially mini patch cuts, right? So in terms of the acres that were treated on the Lincoln, we ended up selecting the packs in conjunction with Lincoln National Forest staff. So Mickey Mauder, who is now retired but was a timber sales manager there for the Lincoln for a long time, helped lay these out. They were decided on for a variety of reasons, access, economic viability in terms of what sort of wood was there. And then, of course, owl aspects as well. Were there owls there and those sorts of things? Were there trapping grids that were already there from the Rocky Mountain Research Station? So all of those things were considered in terms of the 5 packs that we selected for treatment. Of course, how much could the grant actually cover in terms of that work was important too, and we'll talk about that. If you were to go back to that previous map, which I'll show you here, and you imagine one of these packs essentially cut in half, and then you added up, not the actual acres of patch cuts, but the acres that sort of, contained those patch cuts as essentially parts of those packs. We treated a total of 491 acres, about 500 acres, and moved about 1.2 million board feet of timber. This was actually wood that was, some local loggers here, Jensen Contracting, some guys that have been in Ruidoso for a long time, did the actual work, and then the timber was moved down to El Paso and utilized by Adolfo Torres at Custom Crate and Pallet, and you can see an aerial shot of his yard there. Certainly produced a lot of usable things from the wood that was removed from these areas, and I think that's also something to really think about when it comes to how we can expand these treatments down the road, the efficacy of these things. They have to be commercially viable. There has to be somebody using the wood. If we ever hope to address really these broad issues in terms of the millions of acres of land that might need to be treated in the Southwest to actually reduce the threat of high severity fire. So in terms of treatments on Mescalero lands, I've intentionally sort of put these in a smaller scale, a little bit more concern about where packs are here and privacy of data. But you can see sort of broadly, at least, the pack outlines here on these maps are in blue. Our small mammal trapping grids, in terms of the surveys that we use to monitor owl prey base, are shown there, pointed to by the arrows. And the smaller areas are the ones that received broadcast fire. And the one on the left is actually the one that we just completed last week, and quite happy with the results there. I have some pictures of it coming up. So again, 2 protected activity centers on Mescalero lands received this broadcast fire. A number of folks on this call I know are familiar with the ins and outs of trying to put fire on the ground. It's quite difficult for a number of reasons. Burn windows tend to be difficult to find these days, and times when it's both safe and when you'll get adequate consumption. Both of the packs that were burned had been previously mechanically treated. I can, if folks are interested in the specifics there, I can address that later on. But essentially there was commercial harvests in both of those in the 90s, and then one of them had a follow-up PCT, pre-commercial thin, and another one actually had a hazardous fuels reduction thinning that occurred. But we did get a good burn window, and we ended up getting some pretty good fire on the ground. So as I mentioned previously, the initial firing operations 2014 didn't go that well, but we were able to get back in and get some fire on the ground again this year. And then 1 pack on Mescalero lands received mechanical treatment. This was a PCT treatment. It was a mixed. It wasn't mixed together. It was sort of segregated, but there was essentially a single tree selection and then a shelter wood. 120 acres total there, and you can see the outline of our trapping grids on that map as well. Now, what are the strengths of this program? And I'll try to hurry up since I know I'm running out of time. And I mentioned this already, but while public managers have had difficulty implementing forest treatments for a variety of reasons in MSO habitat, since the original listing, sovereign managers and folks on Mescalero, and that includes the Bureau of Indian Affairs, have continued to conduct management activities, including commercial timber harvesting, pre-commercial thinning, etc. So the real strength, at least in my opinion, of this project is that it bridged this really important collaborative gap between the Lincoln and the Mescalero tribe in terms of addressing some of these issues. So what everyone's probably hoping for are these results, and this is where everybody, if I could hear you, would let out the collective groan. Not a lot of results to report, and let me tell you why. What I can say is that owls are continuing to occupy and successfully reproduce at packs where they were prior to treatments. But the issue with that is we're only a year out. Owls are long-lived species. They have known high site fidelity. And so we're not really sure that this is meaningful. I mean, you know, if this was 7 years out, I think it would be meaningful. But we're only a year out, 2 years out on Lincoln lands, less than a year out. Actually, we just completed treatments, obviously, on Mescalero lands, although they were all commercially harvested previously and showed owl occupancy, but that's a discussion for another time. So that's one of the reasons why there's not a lot of substantive stuff to report yet. We've had no detectable difference in small mammal species composition or abundance. We haven't actually crunched the numbers on that, so that's really sort of an anecdote. I actually haven't gotten the data from the Forest Service from their trapping efforts this past summer yet. But again, you know, that's one of those things where we need, you know, in order to account for year-to-year variation in precipitation and just standard ecological differences, we need a multi-year data set. And so we're not at that point yet. I did put a picture of Sarah up here because if I Google Mescalero small mammal trapping or anything like that, Sarah's got a lot of pictures that pop up, and then one of my field assistants, Matt Gonzalez, there as well. So what are the realistic expectations? Well, we've done some treatments. We've put some fire on the ground. We have to think about reentries, right? I mean, you know, you do a mechanical treatment, 10 years later, you need to do another mechanical treatment. You burn, 10 years later, you need to burn. So that's something that really needs to be thought of. And then long-term post-treatment monitoring, you know, is very critical as well. How long? Do we need 4 years, 5 years, 10 years, 3 years? What's the funding there? You know, so that's a very critical thing. And I think it's worth bearing in mind as these projects move forward in owl habitat that we need to get data as to the actual long-term impacts. So I mentioned challenges. I'll just briefly go over this. The biggest challenge I think so far with the implementation of this work has been burning. And obviously if you can get a good burn window and you can put some fire on the ground, the burning takes care of itself. But getting a good burn window is difficult. Getting a burn plan that everyone likes and that will be approved is difficult. So last year we went back and forth. We never got a good burn window. This year we did get a good burn window and we've gotten some good fire on the ground. But burning has really been fairly difficult. Loggers, it's easy to get them in, get some mechanical treatments done, but the burning has been more difficult. And then, you know, the idea of, you know, getting back into some of our mechanical areas, some of those open canopy treatments on Lincoln lands and also burning in there, that would be ideal, but that's a very difficult area to work in. It's, you know, mixed conifer forest, high fuel loading outside of those open canopy treatments, adjacent to the WUI, although it would really be great to try to, and it would be a much more appropriate mimic of natural disturbance if we could get some fire in the ground. It's unlikely that we'll find a window and we'll find some folks that are willing to get in there and burn that. So that's certainly a challenge and something to think about. Other things include, of course, sample size. I'd like to improve the sample size here. We're talking with the collaborative group about, you know, writing another CFRP application for next year to implement these treatments in more packs on Lincoln lands and to get some more mechanical and fire on the ground on Mescalero lands. There's a lot of old data that was collected under the Rocky Mountain Research Station, and whether that data is appropriate to use for trying to draw conclusions. Cost, of course, is important. You know, the commercial viability, this was not a commercially viable project. It cost a lot of money to get these open canopy treatments done on Lincoln lands, and we recouped very little of that money. So those are things to think about moving down the road. Some thoughts that I had that I wanted to mention before I wrap up. You know, there's a number of folks out there working on similar projects. So Sarah, who's a collaborator on this project and I think might be on the call today, hopefully, she's using satellite data to compare occupied habitat on the Lincoln and Mescalero lands, getting some interesting results there. Of course, a lot of folks are familiar with FORFRI, the Forest Restoration Initiative. It has plans to implement treatments on many acres of MSO habitat. I know that Shala Headwall is working on the Flagstaff Watershed Protection Project. That'll be implementing some mechanical treatments, some cable logging, some helicopter logging, some cool stuff like that, as well as prescribed fire and occupied habitat adjacent to Flagstaff. And you know, it's worth mentioning that the recovery plan does call for sharing of these sorts of data. And you know, I would just like to sort of reinforce that idea. I think it's important that if a number of folks are working on the same thing, that we all get together and, you know, look at what we're finding, because, you know, at the end of the day, it's important that this work is translated into management actions. And so I don't know who the facilitator for that would be. Obviously, I think the Fish and Wildlife Service would be in the prime position to sort of facilitate that sort of thing, but I would encourage everyone who's on the call today who works on spotted owls and forest restoration to be thinking about how we can share data in a way that's effective and strategic as we move forward with these large-scale efforts in the Southwest. So last slide here, or second to last slide anyway, there's the collaborators on this CFRP program, various, of course, Mescalero Apache Tribe and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Lincoln National Forest, Youth Conservation Corps, Rocky Mountain Research Station, Forest Guild, number of folks collaborated here. And then not pictured is Jensen Contracting, which is our local contractors, operators out of Ruidoso. So many thanks. I'll run through these really quick. Christy Wampler, who used to be the CFRP coordinator on the Lincoln National Forest, has now moved over to the Daniel Boone National Forest, was critical in getting all this put together and getting everyone together. Along those same lines, both Thora, who's with the DRMP at Mescalero, Thora Padilla, and then Bill Hornsby at BIA in Mescalero were also very critical in terms of getting some stuff done on Mescalero lands. Folks on the Lincoln, Jack Williams, the district biologist in the Sacramento district, he was familiar with the project. He knew sort of broadly what the goals of RMRS were. He was critical in sort of pushing this through with forest leadership. Mickey, one of those, salt of the earth timber guys that had, boots on the ground for the last 30 years, knew the landscape better than just about anybody. And then two former RMRS guys, both Ryan Jonas and Todd Rollinson, were critical in helping me understand what the goals were and what the trapping protocols were and just being there. Ryan, led the trapping crew a couple seasons on the Sacramento district, and without him, I don't know that we could have gotten any of the important monitoring done. Then, of course, Joe Gainey at the Rocky Mountain Research Station. I've been able to call him, talk with him this morning, in fact, about some of these things, advice, those sorts of things. And Sarah, last but not least, certainly, Sarah's with the Forest Service and also at NAU. She's been really important. She had a long-standing good relationship with Mescalero and really helped bridge that gap. Other folks that I should mention, Erica and Jody at BIA, Sharon Paul was important. Kim Kuhar I mentioned already. Several other folks, Chris Little helped with the burning operations this past month, and then Eitan Kraslovsky at the Forest Guild and Barb Wolfson here at Southwest Fire Science Consortium. Everybody's been really important in terms of making this project happen. So with that, I've done my job. I've successfully used up almost all the time, so hopefully I won't get any hard questions in the remaining 7 minutes. But if you have any questions, there's my email address. I'm always happy to hear from you, and I think Xander's going to tune back in now and open up the lines or see if we have any questions that I can answer. So thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Quentin. And that was a great presentation. You covered a lot of ground. As you said, we don't have a lot of time for questions, and I know you have another meeting to get to at 1. So we'll jump right in. And Jeremy Bailey typed in a question, and please, other folks, feel free to do the same. And he asks, is your difficulty in accomplishing the desired amount of prescribed burning an indicator of something that we need to address? Is everyone else also struggling to accomplish their prescribed acres? What can we do about this? So I guess part of that question is how you talked about some of the difficulties you face with prescribed fire and burn windows. Were there differences that you knew about between acres you were trying to burn and other acres maybe not related to MSO that were being burned in the southeastern New Mexico?
Well, I guess I would say that broadcast fire is a different sort of animal than pile burning, and I think everyone would sort of agree with that. So getting broadcast fire in the ground can be tricky, and in places that are adjacent to communities, there's issues with smoke. Obviously, the concern of a prescribed fire escape from a broadcast perspective is a big concern for fire managers. I think it's an issue. I think there's a lot of folks that are working on it. The CFRP program has funded some capacity building grants in recent years in terms of improving our capacity for prescribed fire. I was really impressed with the willingness and ability of the Mescalero folks to put some fire on the ground. I think that's a really good thing. I think it's a model that could be emulated because, at the end of the day, we got some good fire on the ground, and it's difficult when you're potentially going to be held liable for an escape. That can be a tricky thing, but yeah, honestly, I do think that improving capacity for prescribed fire is something we need to address. There's no question about it. So.
Great, thank you. Jay asked a question about, given the objective to reduce fire hazard and the difficulty you encountered with prescribed burning, Jay is wondering how much residual logging slash remained in mechanically treated areas, just in tons per acre, for example, and how you chose to deal with it.
So that's a good question. I don't have any stats on the actual tons per acre on those open canopy treatments on Lincoln National Forest lands. The idea was that they were that all the trees would be removed and moved to decks, but there was just, because of the way in which they were skidded and delimbed, we ended up with a decent amount of slash on the ground. And I think one of the concerns that I've discussed with some other folks is that it could potentially be inhibiting, vegetative regrowth. And at this point, we're just going to sort of see what happens. I've broached the idea of trying to put some fire on the ground in there, and that hasn't really gone over very well, in part because it's, mixed conifer forest with heavy fuel loading directly adjacent to it, near cloud crops, so these things are difficult. But we're working on it. I mean, part of this is figuring out what works and what doesn't and developing these adaptive strategies. And so right now, that's the issue I was referring to, is some of the slash that was left on the Lincoln lands. And there's really no specific plans to deal with it because, for no other reason, we don't have any funding left in the grant. Now, if we can sort of cajole folks on the Lincoln, other managers to think about maybe putting some fire on the ground or piling up some of the residual slash and doing some pile burns, then hopefully we can deal with it that way.
Great, thank you. Haluki asks, any plan to quantify reduction in catastrophic fire risk in treated packs?
Ooh, that's I'm not sure I even want to go there. And I will say that I'm not a big fan of catastrophic fire, or the term catastrophic fire, because I prefer something like high severity. In all honesty, what we've seen with some of the high severity fires that burn here is that fuels reduction treatments can serve to provide more opportunities to suppress those fires, but they're not necessarily going to be a panacea in terms of preventing high severity fire. So we don't really have any plans to quantify that. I think it'd be really difficult to do without actually having a fire come through and seeing what the impacts were. That may very well happen at some point, but no plans specifically to actually try to quantify that. So.
Okay, and I'm peppering you with questions to take advantage of your time before you have to go. But
no worries.
Amy Waltz asks, do researchers know the level of owl site fidelity in this region, i.e. the Sacramentos? And will we be able to see occupancy changes due to the treatments, or is this more of a question having to do with owl nesting success?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Actually, Joe Gainey and a number of co-authors wrote a paper just last year in the Journal of Raptor Research about the use of packs by MSOs in the Sacramento Mountains. And I believe, and I apologize if I get this wrong, but I think they had packs that were being used for up to 25 years or 24 years. That's a pretty high site fidelity. So it's looking like site fidelity is extremely strong here, robust. I doubt we'll see much in the way of occupancy changes due to treatments, in particular because we've seen a lot of mechanical treatments on Mescalero lands where we didn't see much in the way of occupancy changes. So that's anecdotal at this point, but my guess is owls will continue to occupy these habitats. They have so far. I think if we do detect a change in the owls, I'm going to guess that we're not going to, but we will probably see something with nest success. That would be the idea. And then, as a proxy for that, maybe some prey abundance dynamics will change.
Okay, and I think we'll end with one last question from Cassandra, and she asks, why were the patch cuts limited to half acre to 1 acre size, and do you see any benefits in creating larger patch cuts?
That's another good question. I would say that we aimed for half acre to 1 acre. I can tell you that with the ins and outs of having a crew out there marking them and then having folks on the ground actually doing the cutting, they may have gotten a little bit larger than that in some places. I can see benefits in creating larger patch cuts, particularly from a fire mitigation perspective. The larger the cut, the more you disrupt fuel continuity. But there's certainly a tipping point there with how it impacts owls. I don't know that we know that, and so certainly from an experimental paradigm, it could be very useful. So yeah, I could say yes, and one of the reasons why we stuck to that, because that was the strategy that was developed by RMRS, and in many ways, because they had a decade worth of pre-treatment data, we were trying to sort of do what they had planned to do, but I can see the value there.
Great, and I know there's some other great questions there, and I would urge you, if you do have follow-up questions, to email Quentin, but he does have some departmental responsibilities we need to let him get to. So again, thank you so much, Quentin, and I hope everybody, all the participants, will join us on future webinars. This has been a great turnout and great conversation. The last little thing I'm going to put in the chat window, there's a survey, and I hopefully set it up so that when I dismiss you all from the webinar, you'll be taken to the survey. Please do fill it out because we benefit from your responses. So thanks, everyone, particularly to you, Quentin. This is a great webinar, and I hope to talk to you all soon.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.